Welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 3, Episode 21, the season finale. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
Well, Steve, we got a real treat for the listeners for our season finale. It's very exciting, a very special guest who made time in a busy and getting busier schedule with his new show debuting on CNN+. Tell the people who we've got as our special guest today.
We've got the big dog, Scott Galloway, serial entrepreneur, author, podcast host. Yeah, going to CNN. Full disclosure here, we've been trying to get Scott on the pod pretty much since the beginning, and we finally landed him. So closing out strong, Season 3, which is also hard to believe that we are, 60 plus episodes into this thing. So that's pretty exciting as well. Right.
Yeah, listen, it's been, it is, and we'll remind the listeners, we've been renewed for Season 4, so we're ready for Season 4, and we're going to kick off Season 4. We're going to take a bit of a hiatus, and we're going to kick it off in and around mid-January, and our very special guest to kick off the season with panache is the CEO of
Ulta, one of the most remarkable brands, I think, in the retail world today. So that's going to be pretty exciting. They're lighting it up and got a lot going on. So that's going to be a great conversation.
Yeah, and so it's David Kimball, the CEO, and we've already kind of structured our questions and we've been back and forth. So it's really going to be good because we'll also take what are your strategies for Ulta, but also a forward look. Beginning of January, we got a kind of a forward looking. What do you think is going to happen at retail this year? As we enter, and I guess this kind of puts some kind of color commentary on at least the end of holiday and the beginning of next year, which is this new outbreak. You know, I've lost track. Is it wave 4, wave 3, wave 5? So that's going to have some kind of impact. It already is. As we were talking off mic in New York City on Broadway here in Canada, retail in the province of Quebec just got closed down to 50% of capacity. So what they call the circuit breakers are starting to kick in. Looking forward to getting to our guest, but let's jump in and talk about the news. You're just back from the Middle East. So in the moments that you've been awake in odd hours, no doubt, what have you observed and what's caught your eye?
Well, probably the biggest piece of macroeconomic news, as we touch on, I guess, every month for a little while here, the U.S. Commerce Department puts out their report on retail sales. Once again, the media seems to focus on the month-over-month numbers, which I don't particularly care about, but they did report the year-over-year numbers for the month of November. A little bit of momentum slowing, but overall, the consumer is spending. They do some category breakdowns, and most of the categories, so for example, clothing and apparel, sporting goods, furniture, electronics, those sort of breakdowns, we maybe put the link in the show notes if people want to get more detail, but all of them are up low to mid-teens year over year. A couple places where things have slowed down a bit, relatively speaking, grocery and personal care, but still up year over year. So the consumer spending, some of this people have been speculating, aside from just the stimulus impact, pent-up demand, all those sort of things we've talked about a bunch, is that holiday shopping moved up earlier. So November is a bit distorted because of what might have happened in December because of fear of stockouts, that sort of thing. Yeah, so a couple of things I just going to mention quickly. There was also some reporting around Black Friday sales versus Cyber Week sales, and this kind of supports that narrative as well. Black Friday sales rose 14% year over year. Cyber Week grew by just 3%. You know, again, it's kind of suggestion that everything shifted a little bit earlier. I guess we really won't know until we see the December numbers. One other thing is you mentioned with regard to some of the earnings discussions, Lowe's, the big home improvement retailer, essentially signaled that they were starting to see some real headwinds in terms of consumer demand, and they thought it's actually possible that next year their comp store sales would be down. So I think we've got, again, this kind of post, dead cat bounce kind of thing going on, comparing to some easy numbers last year, stimulus running out, pent-up demand, being concentrated into a narrow period. And I think this generally portends a pretty significant slowdown for next year. But anyway, we'll have more info in in December. I don't know. Have you seen any other stats for Canada or any other markets?
Well, actually, I had a great conversation for my The Voice of Retail podcast with your friend of mine, Rob Garf from Salesforce.
Yeah, Rob, yeah.
And we were talking about, and he says hi, by the way.
He's a great guy.
And we were talking about, he's got so much data at his disposal, right? Like real-time data. So it was a great opportunity. And he was sharing basically what you were saying, that the customer got the message, they shopped early. So it was less a reflection on the day and the event. And I was sharing with him how you've referred to it as the hypey holidays, that, it's a little overblown. So we got into a bit of that discussion, but he reflected exactly what you're saying and said the momentum continues basically from the Salesforce data, which is so robust on both sides of the border. So that's a great interview. We talked about a bunch of the interesting things. And to your point about Lowe's, as I talk to home improvement retailers here, the only question is how long can this go? They've been on a growth tailwind, unbelievable thanks to the COVID era. You can only buy so many refrigerators and so many renovations now. So I think it's inevitable that their comps start to kind of slow down. The only thing that could keep their comps going is if housing starts and people start moving again, because that drives a big sector of their business. But
I was going to say, I think a lot of times, at least in the U.S., the focus in the media on Lowe's, Home Depot, and others is really the consumer side. But they've also got a very big pro business, and so whether it's new home construction, major remodeling, renovation projects, I mean, that's clearly, at least in the U.S., that's clearly been driving a lot of the business too. And there are definitely signs that that's starting to slow down.
I would add one more thing. The grocers, actually on both sides of the border, I saw this from the CEO of Kroger and Michael Medline, the CEO of Sobeys, said the same thing last week, is they are detecting a more permanent shift still with consumers shopping grocery and cooking on their own versus going out. Now, that may just be a hangover of resistance or reluctance to go out for dinner the way we used to. I certainly think it's a reflection of less business happening over dinner, right? There's less trade shows. You don't go out as much. All right. Well, let's hold a mirror up in front of Lululemon. What would we see? Mirror, mirror on the wall.
Well, I think last quarter, the lack of mention about Mirror, their acquisition of the technology workout at home platform, was conspicuous in its absence. They did this time around talk about how they are cutting the sales estimate for the at-home gym part of their business in half. So that is obviously a big
half,
at least conceptual write down. So, whether that is a function of, we can sort of interpret a little bit what's going on here from some of Peloton's numbers as well, where there is a moderation in the purchasing of workout at home kind of equipment as we kind of get out of the pure depths of the COVID times. I suspect it's a mix of not seeing that kind of hyper growth in general in the workout at home, or to your earlier point, it's like, how many Pelotons are you going to buy? How many mirror systems can somebody buy? How many sofas can somebody buy? Right? There's just a limit. But I think that it also suggested that their projections were pretty rosy. So that's a big shift. Overall, Lululemon as a company is killing it. But I guess the hopes for this being a major growth driver are definitely being tempered.
Calvin McDonald runs a great shop. I wonder how many distractions they can handle. I think it takes everything they've got to just make sure the supply stays, with the supply chain challenges, that they keep the momentum going in the core business. And I got to think it takes their eye off the ball from an ancillary business like this. Maybe they come back to it when things moderate and they go, okay, we got this mirror thing. Let's we've got a big installed base now. Let's really grow it. So right. I remain optimistic about the category in general, but I think for Lululemon, they literally have bigger fish to fry than, getting people to use Mirror would be my kind of.
Well, and they've also, in addition to store expansion and a bunch of other things going on, they've been really emphasizing growing their men's business, which is actually doing quite well. So they've got a lot. Yep. They've got a lot going on, and for the most part, everything, despite all the challenges with supply chain and whatnot, things overall are very, very good there. So.
And Nike, they bought a bunch of letters of the alphabet. I couldn't make heads or tails of it.
Yes, a company. So it's RT. Let's see, I have to cheat. RTFKT Studios. They bought. I understand that the kids pronounce that brand Artifact. They make digital versions of sneakers and other collectibles I'm not exactly sure. I mean, I kind of know what that means. This is part of the Metaverse strategy.
Yeah.
The second life to second life, as I think both of us have joked about. So Nike, I mean, it's interesting. Nike, I'm a huge fan of Nike's strategy. I love the way they experiment with things, and they continue to kind of push the envelope. And they've certainly talked quite a lot about participating in a metaverse strategy. And so this is another step. Not a particularly big company, part of their strategy to really build out NFTs and just other kind of metaverse-ish technology and products. So one to watch.
Oh, I was going to say, in addition to acquiring the technology or renting it, I think they're acquiring the talent, the people.
Sure.
Well, all right. Well, that was actually pretty exciting news, considering that we're just almost at the holidays. It's typically kind of a slower news. So this wraps up the season 3 part of our news. We'll be back in January to kind of wrap up and take a quick look at whatever happened on, at least for the first episode. We'll just see what happened over the holidays. Now, a reminder to our listeners, check out our YouTube channel. And everyone, smash every subscribe button you can find, whether it's on your favorite podcast platform or on YouTube. And let's now get to our great interview with the one and only, the big dog, Scott Galloway.
Well, we're very excited to welcome Scott Galloway to the podcast. I think last time, Scott, you and I spoke was on my book launch, and I appreciate your support on that. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Good to be with you.
All right. Well, Scott, I feel like there's so much we can talk about, so it's hard to choose. But I was wondering, I know you've been pretty active on Twitter and elsewhere talking about social media. There's so much going on. We've got brands like Lush pulling out. We finally got, I guess, Jack Dorsey moving on from Twitter. I'm just kind of curious where you are on how brands should think about leveraging social media, what your view is, what's going on Twitter next. Are you short or long? Just in general, what's your hot take on the exciting world of social media these days?
Well, if you want sort of outsized returns, typically from a brand or even an individual standpoint, the people who and the organizations that get outsized returns are typically on their marketing or branding efforts or customer acquisition efforts are usually ones that embrace and are really deft with new mediums. So whether it was Trump and Twitter or Elon Musk and Twitter, or, Kennedy and television, whatever it might be, Nike and television, Williams Sonoma catalogs. I would argue that the last kind of 5 or 7 years, if you were going to find a retailer or a smaller kind of consumer aspirational brand that made tremendous progress, they were usually very good at leveraging emerging mediums or really understanding and making a big investment early. And I would argue those medium, that kind of the medium last decade was probably Instagram, whether it's Lululemon or Sephora. When you think of retailers that have sort of punched above their weight class and done really well, there's usually, they usually have kind of overscored. They punch above their weight class on Instagram. And I would argue the next one is TikTok. I think TikTok is extraordinary in terms of its adoption, sort of faster 0 to 1 billion than I think any social media platform in history. And distinctive kind of the headline risk coming out of China around ByteDance. I still think that's a huge opportunity for retailers. And then this live video selling that is big in China that has really incredible conversion rates. In terms of Twitter, which is sort of a side hobby for me, I'm kind of semi-obsessed with the company as a user and as I've invested a few times. It's one of the few stocks I kind of trade around, I guess. Look, I've said this for a while. I think Twitter does not command the space it occupies. I think a company that this influence and reach should not be trading below its IPO price. It's underperformed every social media company, much less, probably every SaaS or tech company. And I think it's a big opportunity. But I just don't meet with retailers or brands that say, oh, we need to spend more on Twitter. It just, we talk about it. But so I think Twitter is remarkably under-monetized. In terms of how it impacts retailers, though, I'm not sure. I don't even think Twitter's really in the conversation for most brands and retailers. I think it's an afterthought.
I'm curious, just before we move off of social media, are there any brands or personalities that you think are kind of lurking beneath the surface that you're following because they're doing interesting things that haven't quite gotten that reach or engagement yet, and maybe folks should be looking at for some ideas?
That's a really generous question. I wish I had better answers. So Do you know who Jessica? I think Jessica Yellen, News Not Noise. She does this kind of a rundown of the day's news, and she tries to kind of call balls and strikes. And she does it on Instagram. And I find the format and her voice is so outstanding. I think it's a fantastic news and media property. I think they do a great job. I'm biased. I'm an enormous fan of CNN. I get their CNN kind of 5 things emails in the morning. I really enjoy CNN. I'm watching less CNBC. I don't know. And then but I don't have what I'd call people. A lot of times I kind of come up with a better rap. People ask me where I get my ideas or influence. And it's kind of, I get a lot of it from Twitter. I think Twitter does a pretty good job of having stuff bubble up. And I'm also really fortunate. I have a group of kids, or I call them kids, young men and women who forward me notes on almost everything I do with interesting articles and data. But I wouldn't say I have like a secret weapon, like, oh, follow this guy or gal. There's a bunch of people who are really inspiring. I think Ben Thompson at Stratechery does an amazing job, is incredibly prolific around technology. I love Bob Lefsetz. He's actually a music industry guy, but I just find he's such a clear blue flame thinker. I love the way he talks about stuff. But in terms of retail, Steve, I follow some of your stuff. As a professor, I follow out of Carl at McGill up north, who I think you know as well, Stephen. I don't know. It feels like there aren't a ton of thought leaders given what a big industry it is.
Put that on the New Year's resolutions.
There you go. Get on it.
There you go. Scott, we may or may not be at this tail end of the COVID era. It feels like the goalposts keep moving a bit, but we're kind of making progress. We're almost exactly, if not exactly a year away or a year out from post-corona, from crisis to opportunity, your book. As you reflect on the past year, has it changed or modified, or what you've observed? Do you have anything to add to your earlier observations? How do you think customers have changed, and how are you continuing to think about that?
Well, COVID's sort of enduring feature will be as an accelerant more than a change agent. If you look at the majority of real changes, it's just taken existing trends and accelerated them a decade, or dramatically increased the slope of that trajectory. So I just got off my podcast at Pivot. We were interviewing 2 people about remote work. And I think the office industrial complex will never be the same. I think we've gotten really good at figuring out a way to rent our human capital to organizations remotely. And we start at this notion that, it must be a reduction in productivity. I think when you take the 10 hours a week of commuting that a lot of people endure, and the amount of time you spend getting ready, and the cost to put you in this amalgam of steel, glass, and asbestos known as an office, you just think there's just so much additional resources and productivity that we start from, even if you're less productive, not bumping off of people. So I think there's a permanent destruction. Some things are permanently altered. I think the shift to remote work is a structural shift, not a cyclical one. I think malls, movie theaters were all weakening. There is a consolidation in retail, and that is once the rains return and there's a culling of the herd, there's more foliage for the surviving elephants, and you're seeing a dramatic reshaping of the retail landscape where it's very difficult for even smaller franchisees of big brands to survive. There's consolidation because you got to be able to make the requisite tech investments. You got to make the requisite changes in format and supply chain. I'm on the board of Panera, and it just strikes me how much where our focus has been is, all right, you think of a traditional cafe, but how do we figure out a way to configure it such that it's easy to pick up and never get out of your car, or come into the buy online, pick up in store, or smaller footprint, or temporary stores in high density areas. It's just all around supply chain and reconfiguration of the supply chain and technology. Over 50% of our orders now are digital. And when you think about it, the majority of restaurants just can't make those sorts of investments. They just don't have the skills, they don't have the capital. So I think you're going to see, and it's not a good thing. I think you're going to see further consolidation, but retail the last 20 years has generally speaking been just a really shitty place to work or invest unless you work for Amazon. And we have these well-publicized examples of the few winners, whether it's Restoration Hardware or Lululemon. But generally speaking, if you took Amazon out of every ETF that tracks retail stocks, it's just been a terrible place to work or invest, because we have one retailer that's now worth more than probably all of, the majority of retail in Europe combined. And that's the behemoth out of Seattle. So I wonder, though, if there's an opportunity coming out of this. I'm just trying to relate it to retail, and that is, I was on the board of Urban Outfitters. Now I'm on the board, as I mentioned, of Panera. I think a lot about retail. I've kind of cursed to it. I enjoy it. I think it's a tremendous opportunity to open stores because for the first time in probably 3 decades, power or leverage has swung back from the landlord to the tenant. Mm-hmm. And for the first time I'm seeing, first time in my career in retail, I'm seeing percentage of revenue deals from tier A tenants. So who never would have previously even considered that type of arrangement. And the thing about retail that's so dangerous as it relates to leases is that if you screw up and you pick the wrong location, it's a 10-year weeping sore of cash. And because landlords had so much leverage, like, no, you got to sign up for 10 years. You got to enter into a contract that says you'll pay us this much every month for 10 years. And then you find it doesn't work after 3 months. You're like, okay, we've got 9 3/4 years of this liability. Right. And so percentage of revenues is huge swing back and leverage to the tenant. So what I see is I see opportunity in bricks. I mean, you have to be multi-channel. It's difficult to get above a certain revenue level without offering, access to multiple channels. But in terms of return on investment, return on invested capital, Google and Facebook have such extraordinary control over the digital ecosystem that they've slowly but surely raised rents. I mean, let's talk about Amazon. In 2014, the percentage of revenue that they secured from their retailers on their third-party platform was 19%. So to pay for their fulfillment, to pay for the Amazon Media Group, you had to pay Amazon about 19% of 19 cents on every dollar you got on their platform. It's now 34%. So the consolidation across digital marketing and Amazon in terms of e-commerce has just meant those 3 players every year have raised their rents. And so I think what you might have is when you have a decline in the rental power or the rents of bricks and mortar and an increase in the rents on digital, all of a sudden bricks and mortar begin to look economically viable again or economically attractive. So I would argue that if you're in a position to play offense, your return on the invested dollar right now is actually maybe greater in opening bricks.
It's probably one of the ironies of the COVID era is there's a lot of movement and opportunity in physical retail where your neighborhood, Soho, for example, has got lots of space where that used to be such a premium, unattainable for a lot of brands.
Everything's empty. It's,
one of my dreams, Scott, is to have you and Mark Andreessen in like a cage match, where you... So it turns out...
That guy'd win. He's big and he strikes me as mean. He doesn't do a lot of media, though.
I'm not going to comment on that. So one question, you talked about how poor the returns have been in retail in general. Maybe this is as good a time as any to talk about some of these digital native brands and which have perhaps staying power. Obviously, many of them are moving into physical retail very aggressively, which I certainly find pretty ironic. And what's your take on how many of these digitally native brands really have staying power and what people should be paying attention to as we get more IPOs, more earnings reports?
Well, it's sort of, I don't know, what's old is new again, and that is retail. I mean, channel strategy and supply chain are super important. And then obviously merchandising and voice. And when I think of some of the most successful retailers over the last decade, they generally have a few things in common. They're vertically integrated. They've not only forward integrated into stores, whether it's Apple or, I look at what Restoration Hardware's done with their Grand Palazzos or whatever they call their stores, which I think are just incredibly visionary. You want to be vertical. You want to control the product. You want to control the distribution to try and maintain margin power. And it's very difficult to point to any retailer kind of what multi-brand retailer has really killed it. Maybe Home Depot. Walmart's just done okay, I guess. But the guys that have outsized returns, you talked about digitally native brands. Warby Parker's done really well, but Warby Parker's vertical, proprietary. I think merchandise value proposition. They've taken what used to be $300 and $500 glasses and a very fat and happy incumbent with Luxottica, and their stores are wonderful. They started online, but I would argue that the point of differentiation is actually their bricks now, which I think are really inspiring. I look at Allbirds. I think they're going to be challenged. I don't think that their product's differentiated. Their in-store experience is okay, but I wonder if it's sort of too fashionable. And I look at their customer acquisition costs and the way they they've had some sleights of hand in the way they report their numbers. I think they're going to fall under pressure. And then there's other, I wouldn't call them a retailer, but I'm just thinking about recent IPOs. On Running had an enormously successful IPO, but I think that brand is highly differentiated. When you talk about, to say that you're kind of digitally native, it's like saying you're electricity native, and that is okay. it's everybody's digital now. Williams Sonoma does a great job online,
right?
And their background is in database-driven kind of catalogs and merchandising, so they're just very good at it. To be successful, are you great at digital or great at bricks? And the answer is yes, right? There's just going to be very few retailers that ever get above a certain watermark in terms of revenues and or margins, unless they do a really good job of all of them. I look at Nike. I've consulted to Nike and Samsung for the last decade, and I said the same thing to them every year. You got to go vertical. You got to have a greater percentage of your sales controlled in a brand aspirational environment. Nike listened, Samsung did not. And Nike, I think, is about a third of their revenues, maybe more. It'll probably be half within 5 or 7 years. They're done through controlled channels, either their own stores or their own website. And I think that's a reason why Nike, which should have been ground zero for destruction, when you think about a brand that should be susceptible to the decline in the advertising industrial complex and broadcast media, you would think, oh, well, Nike won't do well. Nike's done really well. They've absolutely skated to where the puck was headed and invested more in vertical, whereas I would argue Samsung is going to have difficult time supporting its margins when they have a guy named Roy from Verizon, pushing their product. It's just so. Look, a long-winded way of saying verticalization, multi-channel. I don't think I'm saying anything you guys don't get or understand. There's been some recent retail IPOs. I think people always try and position retail as tech such that they get a bigger multiple. But it kind of is the same thing, right? It's supply chain, it's great merchandising, embracing new mediums. But I think On Running, which is the most successful of them, I think, in terms of IPO, they've just done a great job with product and merchandising and voice. So that's not really changing. I mean, one of the most successful retailers of the last decade, Restoration Hardware, the CEO there is not a Luddite. He appreciates technology, but he's a merchant. And I just walk into those stores and I look around and I'm just fucking inspired. I want to buy everything and I want to stay there for lunch. And it's just, you just think, wow, this wasn't, and it's not, technology is important. I don't know what's going behind the scenes in terms of supply chain, but it feels like we're bifurcating into Amazon and then inspiring. It's like, okay, if it's multi-brand and if it's getting something to me within 48 hours and convenience and selection, Amazon kind of 50 cents on the dollar digitally.
Efficiency or experience, right? It's a bifurcation. I think we owe Steve now a couple of nickels because this bifurcation thing.
You get a small fee every time somebody says bifurcation.
Is that your term?
Or an angel gets
your experience?
I don't know.
That makes sense.
Scott, quick last question. I know we're tight on time. Your strategy sprints have been getting rave reviews. I know Carl Boutet, who you mentioned, did that. Yeah. I recommended it to one of my clients. Is that the future of business education beyond, notwithstanding the fact you're an NYSE Stern prof? Well, how do you see the future of education? And will employers acknowledge and start to recognize that as what should I say, legitimate versus traditional kind of university college choices and creds?
Well, thanks. That's a generous question. So my online ed startup, Section 4, we're basically trying to take elite business school classes and make them more accessible. $700 or instead of $7,000, and 2 or 3 weeks instead of 12 weeks, no admissions process. And we're a mission-driven organization. If you can't afford to take a course and you want to, we have this very rigorous scholarship process where you send us an email saying you can't afford it, and we let you take it. There's going to be an unbundling of universities. They have created artificial scarcity by creating ridiculously, this rejectionist culture where they take pride in turning away 90% of their applicants. We have priced ourselves not out of the market, but I believe one of the greatest destructions in prosperity across the middle class has been the unrelenting inflation over the last 40 years of higher education. I think there's just a ton of opportunity, whether it's Google certificates or what we're doing at Section 4 or edX or 2U. These companies are doing great work. And I think it's going to place a lot of these schools under pressure. The elite schools will be fine because they can sort of arbitrage their degrees. So they partner with companies and they say, hey, get a degree to be a chief digital officer, and you can put it on LinkedIn, and we'll charge you $25,000. And there's a large market. It's 90 points of gross margin. They get 40 points to the online company who's better at acquiring people online. But they're basically kind of arbitraging or milking the brand equity of their great brands. I think there's a ton of opportunity, and we're already seeing it. More money was raised for edtech startups in the last quarter than in all of 2020, and 2020 was a record year. So you're going to see huge pressure, not placed on so much the elite schools, but the second-tier schools that we're charging an elite price because we're a corrupt cartel. We raise prices in lockstep. And you're going to see, the mother of all chins is waiting for fists of stone is higher ed, where we have raised tuition 1,400% in the last 30 years. And, in higher ed, generally speaking, as administrators and faculty, we ask ourselves the same question every day. How do we increase our compensation while reducing our accountability? And we've managed to do that with this rejectionist culture where we think we're Birkin bags, not public servants. It's very unhealthy for society. And cloak ourselves in nobility and self-aggrandizement and arrogance that results in a lack of access to education, where the elite schools, which are still very powerful, are kind of enforcers of the caste system. And we bring in two cohorts. The children of rich kids, you're 77 times more likely to get into an elite university if you're from a top 1% income earning household. 34 of the top 100 schools have more people in the top 1% than the bottom 60. And then the second cohort is what I affectionately refer to as the freakishly remarkable. And if by the time you're 17, you're captain of your lacrosse team and have built wells in Africa and have a patent on a vaccine, congratulations, welcome to Harvard. But I can prove to each of us mathematically that 99% of our children are not in the top 1%. And so...
Wait, can you go over that again? You had me and then you lost me.
Well, my point... you're being funny.
As a Harvard educated,
trying to be, as a Harvard educated.
There you go. Look, I think this is a big deal. This is a kind of a personal thing for me. And when I applied to UCLA, the admissions rate was 74%. Now it's 12%. So the reason I'm here speaking to you guys is because higher ed used to be seen as a chance to turn unremarkable people and give them unremarkable opportunities. Now it's how do we identify the rich or the freakishly remarkable and turn them into billionaires? So. Yeah. I hope that, couldn't happen to a nicer group of people. I hope that higher ed, its current institution, is kicked in the nuts over and over for the next 10 years at the hands of startups. And also some universities, I'm being a bit reductive here, some universities, including the University of California, have not lost the script. They've committed to expanding their freshman seats by 20,000 students over the next decade. So ASU is doing good work. Purdue refuses to raise their tuition. There is some real innovation, but I'd like to see what I'd call the gale force winds of disruption howl like crazy in the world of higher ed.
I couldn't agree more, and it's one of the things I really, really appreciate. Not only all the provocative things you talk about in retail and consumerism, but I really appreciate the social consciousness that comes through. So if people are not checking out your podcast and your newsletter and all the things that Section 4 are doing, they'll definitely do that. We'll put links in the show notes. Is there anything, Scott, anything new and exciting coming up for 2022 that you want to share that maybe isn't out there quite yet?
I'm writing another book called America in 100 Charts, and I'm trying to find what I think are the 100 most interesting charts that kind of depict where America is and where it's headed. So I'm excited about that. I got my show on CNN Plus starting in March. So I got a lot going on.
And a new doggo. How's the dog?
That's right.
The Great Dane.
The Dane. She's great. It's a joy. It's we have the little one, Gangster, and we have the big one. It sounds obvious, but I didn't realize how big this Great Dane would get. How big it would get. But it's a joy. Do you guys have dogs?
Yeah, I got a Rottweiler German Shepherd combo, which is basically smarter than I am. With way more energy. So it's a blast. It's a blast. Yeah. We're on a similar journey. I got the dog about the same time you did.
I think I need to get a dog. My wife got the dog in the divorce, so I got a little work to do there.
It really is. I'm fascinated. I'm super into dogs. I'm just fascinated about the relationship between humans and beasts, and it's one of the most, maybe this is a negative statement on my life, but it's one of the most rewarding things in my life. I just absolutely love having having dogs. I think it's hugely rewarding.
We'll wrap it out now. Scott, I know you're obviously a super busy guy doing a lot of interesting things. Thanks so much for making the time to spend a few minutes with us, and hope you have a good holiday season, and we'll look forward to everything you're doing next year.
Michael and Steve, thanks so much, and congrats on the pod.
If you like what you heard, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, or your favorite podcast platforms, so you can catch up with all our great interviews. Subscribe so that just automatically shows up. Tell your friends, and also in new insights and new episodes will show up every week. So tell your friends, because that will help us share the word, the good wisdom. Now be sure and check out, and be sure and check us out on our new YouTube channel. Not so new anymore. We got a couple episodes up there, and just look for Remarkable Retail.
And I'm Steve Dennis. You can check out more of my work at my website, stephenpdennis.com, or on Forbes, or on Twitter. And please check out my second edition of my book, Remarkable Retail, How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption, available just about everywhere books are sold.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, producer and host of the Voice of Retail podcast and a bunch of other stuff. You can find me on LinkedIn, learn about me on meleblanc.co. All right, Steve, great episode. Look forward to chatting again next week. Be safe and have a great rest of your day.